Welcome to One Broken Mom, a podcast dedicated to raising awareness of mental health, parenting, and self-improvement. I am the host, Ami Quiriconi. One Broken Mom is not a family show. It is meant for adults and contains sometimes adult language. The topics I cover can be serious and unsettling to people. However, I do have a sense of humor laced with a little bit of a punk rock attitude. So if you're interested in real talks about real stuff by real people so that we can all get better together, well, then you're in the right place, and so welcome. Okay, today, everybody, I am back on with One Broken Mom and Michelle Piper. And remember, Michelle is a marriage and family therapist based out of San Diego, and she has both the personal and professional interest in working, I wouldn't say exclusively, but probably pretty heavily with the adult children of narcissistic mothers and survivors of narcissistic abuse. So welcome back, Michelle.
Thank you. It's good to be back, and I'm always so happy to work with you because you have a compassionate view of what it's like to be a mother and also what it's like to deal with a narcissistic mom in the family system. So I appreciate that compassionate viewpoint.
Oh, awesome. And I tell lots of people, and thank you for that, because we all had parents, all of us listening. And the other piece is I've never really wanted this to be a blame game and finger pointing thing, because at the end of the day, the big key message here is that what we're talking about and sharing is not common knowledge. It's not, taught on a regular basis to anybody growing up. How we learn to parent is by the models that we have, and we've all been shown different things through different experiences. And it really is hard to be very judgmental against people that, may have behaved in ways that left us feeling badly and may, are leaving some of us going through therapy to repair some of that. But I don't know. I think it's the rare person who ever intended to go out and have kids and hurt them. Any of that injury has ever come has usually been out of just not knowing. And so coming together to talk about it in a way, I just did an interview earlier before you and I talked, and we were talking at the end of the interview about, mom feeling guilty. I wish I could have done something better. And I thought, what's a great gift is to give our parents who are feeling like, if we're having these conversations with them, is the gift of them knowing that it's not permanent, and I don't think that people, and that's part of this is this change and this talking about it, this digging in and reflecting on it and understanding it means that we can actually undo some of the things that maybe our parents actually do feel guilty about and feel like, well, I didn't know any better. I didn't mean to do that to you. I acknowledge that something's not right now, and I wish I could change it. And the reality is they can't, but we can, and we can do that for them. And so if that helps with a compassionate conversation with your parents about this kind of stuff, is like, hey, I'm just going to take up this now, this work, I'm going to do it. And you no longer need to feel guilty that what you did to me was permanently affected my life in any way, shape, or form. So for anybody that has that, and I'm one of them, has that kind of uncomfortable, element with family dynamics of digging into trauma, maybe that's a way for you to think about it. That it's, you can liberate yourself and liberate them at the same time, from that.
Yeah. And I think, a major way that is always done is through boundaries. Boundaries are compassionate. And, so many people feel that if they have boundaries with a narcissist, then especially a narcissistic parent or grandparent, that they are then somehow standing in judgment. But what you're standing in is in compassion, because you're not letting that person continue to do something that for most of them is not at their core values anyway. They wouldn't want to have this result, and they're incapable perhaps of seeing what their actions do to create that result. And so there are times where hard boundaries may feel as if you're being a judge or judging, but actually what you're doing is protecting you and them from repeating a painful history.
Yeah,
and that's room for potential for a more positive relationship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. And you've talked about that before a lot, that when you've grown up with narcissistic abuse or a narcissistic dynamic, a parent that may not be, 100% narcissist, but behaved narcissistically at times, that as a child in that household, boundaries are violated on a regular basis, and learning how to set boundaries is super awkward and uncomfortable and foreign, to be able to do that. But as I've learned and developed, it definitely, oh my gosh, it feels so much better to hold them and then, high five yourself when you've been able to do that. And it does make a lot of difference in your well-being.
Mm-hmm.
You don't get as violated anymore, and you realize, you kind of gain your own sense of power, that you didn't grow up with or had taken and, from you and stuff. So I appreciate that. Now, we've talked about for 5 months, we were doing the math here, and actually for everybody that's listening to this, Michelle and I are actually looking at each other for the first time in 5 months. We've been doing a lot of phone conversations, but we got the video going today, which is great because Michelle does do coaching worldwide, so she can look at you too if you need some assistance from her later.
Yeah, I need not be in the shadows.
Yeah, she's a real person. But in the 5 months that we've talked about it, we introduced the concept of the narcissistic mother as a type of broken mom. And then we've been drilling down into the different family roles that the children in this family end up either drifting in themselves or being forced into. We started with the golden hero chosen child. We moved to the lost child because we didn't want that one to be the last one and forgotten about. Then we went to the mascot, and now we're here at the final role, which is the scapegoat. And I think this fits nicely because for me, my experience with scapegoats is I kind of feel like this is the personality of the child that just basically said, screw you, everyone, I'm out of here. And so it kind of feels like a conclusion that we're at the mic
Right,
drop. I'm
mic.
done. Yeah. So tell us, what's the scapegoat and why are we going to talk about that child finally today?
The scapegoat is someone who often on the forums, when you get online, you'll see a lot of people saying that they were scapegoated. That's often someone who is quite vocal because they were in the role of truth teller in their family system. Often they were the ones standing up saying, no, this isn't right, or this feels weird, or trying to set boundaries, or being a champion for another sibling to try to protect an underdog. A lot of times they would fall on their sword. They would be somebody who was trying to rescue someone in the family. They got set up as rescuer, and then they get pointed at as the problem. And so often with scapegoats, you will hear that term probably the most talked about, that role talked about. And what I really enjoy about scapegoats is they're so sassy and they're fun, and they tend to be contrarian. They like to kind of look at things from the outside and always question what's going on. Tend to be very creative people. And the price they pay is that sometimes their instincts have been undermined by the narcissistic parent. The narcissistic mom may have gaslit you. Gaslighting is a process of saying to you what you observe is not real. So a classic gaslighting example is you could have a glass of water next to you and say, oh, I'm so glad I have this water. And then the other person can say, there's no water there. And that's the same with, oh, I don't like the way you've treated me. I didn't do anything wrong. Or I didn't appreciate that you were teasing my younger brother, or that you were talking about the neighbor that way. I'm not talking about the neighbor in any, so there's a lot of denial. And then because if you confront a narcissist, often they're going to confront you. The scapegoat ends up having to do a lot of swordplay with the narcissistic parent, and that can be great for the other siblings because then they can get away with murder while the scapegoat is fighting with the parents. So a lot of times the siblings, we're just minors, we're just children, forgive yourself if you did this to your siblings, but you'll serve up the sibling, the scapegoat. You'll be like, well, all I have to do is get scapegoat going, and then I can get away with anything I want because everybody else is distracted with that behavior. And sometimes then the scapegoat gets a little addicted to negative intensity because they feel at least alive, noticed, and powerful at times in that role. So you can see where that could lead to other difficulties in situations where there's authority or groups, and how to not carry the old behaviors from the family into those groups is something to be aware of, especially when in a work environment, when you're trying to navigate group dynamics and work politics.
And this is where listening to this piece of it, because you and I have talked about this as well many times. So for anybody that hasn't listened to the other episodes, is that we in certain family dynamics can drift from these roles, or and as we age or the kind of the landscape of the family changes a little bit, your role kind of shifts with that. And I know that I've spoken about this before, especially in the work environment piece of it is the you can get triggered really easily by somebody contradicting you or your authority, or like you said, if you're sensing something that feels like you're being gaslit by like your boss or a coworker. I know
It can inflame
personally.
you.
Oh, it does. And that was like my Achilles heel, was being in places with authority people. And it's not like I was a troublemaker or anything like that, but, because of my own, like, my addiction to that personality that, guided me into business partnerships and personal relationships, naturally, if you have that scapegoat piece of you in there, it's like, if you hit that trigger, it was just like, oh, like instant, fight back and defend and stuff. And that doesn't work in business. It's like,
Correct. And often, yeah, like if you're in a group situation, even like a group work assignment in an academic setting, there can be times where you perceive something as unfair in the group, and the group will sense, oh, we can get that person to confront the bully or whatever because they have this tendency to do it anyway. So all they need is a little nudge, this little scapegoat. And, you can see this poor little sixth grader championing the good role or the good rule and, taking on a bully when they don't need to.
So that's interesting because if anybody's listened to the other episodes and we talked about the hero and the golden child, what kind of pins in my head is sometimes scapegoat feels a little heroic. Is that a shared, is that a shared trait or possibly one in the same person at times?
At times. So sometimes it's the golden that feels heroic, and other times it's a scapegoat that feels heroic. And both of these heroic roles have their cost, because whenever you are becoming a hero, you're in a triangle. And that triangle, when it's relational, you've got the villain, the victim, and the rescuer. And that's a slippery triangle. So if you come in to rescue someone, you will almost inevitably be pointed to as also the villain eventually. Like somehow you messed it up. And so scapegoats can often get blamed for marital problems, financial problems, stress in the family, health issues. So your father wouldn't have his heart problem if it wasn't for you always arguing. These kinds of statements are made. Or the marriage will be so much better when you're off to college or you've moved out. Sometimes the scapegoat is asked to move out for the sake of some other sibling, and that sets them not getting along with a sibling because it's framed as you are the cause of the problem, so we had to remove you to save this other one. And then scapegoats feels like, okay, I'm not as valuable as the other one, or I'm in competition with this other sibling, or sometimes it's the stepfather or stepmother, however the choice was made.
So it's interesting when I listening to about this. So with the scapegoat having such a confrontational personality to it, is there ever a scapegoat who, and I asked this question, I'm going to ask you this question, like, is there ever a scapegoat? But I think I know an answer to this, where the scapegoat is just a victim. They're just blamed. They aren't a truth teller. They're not going to stand up and and stick up for justice. They are just the pile that everybody dumps all the garbage on top of, and just may not be as heroic or may not be as outgoing.
Right. Yeah. So you have some scapegoats that are fighters, and they take on the shrapnel of life rather early. And a lot of times they actually are, by their 20s, have worked out a great deal of stuff because they've fought through it. Others are what you're talking about, where they kind of collapse inward. They doubt themselves. The gaslighting has caused them to question their self-esteem. So all that, instead of having self-esteem, they have self-blame. And so once the piling on starts to happen, especially if more than the narcissistic parent gangs up on this person, but that narcissistic parent also has engaged in getting the siblings or the co-parent, co-caregiver to see this person that way, starts to handle the PR and the extended family or community as, oh, this is just my difficult child, or, well, watch out for that one. And, that's a terrible thing to do to a kid. It's imbalance of power to have an adult declare that a child has some negative trait. It's incredibly emotionally and intellectually abusive.
Yeah. When you describe that, what pops into my head is when we experience bullies in the grade schools, and even in high schools and stuff like that. And it sounds like what you are really kind of walking through is what home life for those types of kids might in fact actually be like. And I've said this too before with people, like, if there's anything that I despise, it is watching adults bully children. And you're describing the way that, a way in which that actually happens, with them being just blamed at home for everything. And of course, that kid reacts, in a negative way, right?
And I think many of us can recall being at a family table where you're the visitor and you just see, like, why do they keep going at the one kid for everything? And you see this other kid doing similar things, but the one child is getting commented on and corrected, and there's gaslighting right there. One person, the reality is that there's the behavior is not single to that person, yet they're being treated as if it is.
Right, because everything they did is their fault. And so you talk about that self-blame versus self-esteem. Like, what's the difference between self-blaming feelings and just having low self-esteem? Because I wrote low self-esteem in my notes, but I think that maybe you're describing something a little bit deeper than that.
Yeah, what's scary about getting blamed and being falsely empowered with all these negative traits, like you've ruined our marriage or you cause us financial problems, to say to a child when you're an adult, falsely empowers them, makes them feel like they have more control over the situation than they do. And then that means they can blame themselves more for what's going on. They can blame themselves for the broken down car or the gas that ran out, the propane that ran out for the home heat or whatever, because somehow it has to do with them. And that feeds into the way that we grow up and develop as adults anyway. When we go through childhood and especially adolescence, we are egocentric, and one of the things is that that helps us with is to break away and think that we know everything. The big joke is, I knew everything at 16, and then by 30 I knew nothing. That's that healthy egocentrism that needs to be guided out, but it can also flip into self-blame and self-loathing, because if your environment isn't right and you're egocentric, you can start easily to turn that in on yourself and blame yourself. So if you have a parent adding to that, or a significant mentor caregiver, then you can see where the self-blame can really pile up. And self-blame always eats at self-esteem and self-worth. Self-esteem and self-worth are built by following your values and knowing that you're operating consistent with what you believe are the best actions for you. Kind of like if you're following your own standard operating procedures every day, then your slate is clean. Things might have not have gone perfectly, but you still refer back to these values and say, but I'm a good person. Whereas with self-blame, it's I'm bad. If a mistake happens, I'm bad. It's not the mistake happened, it's I'm the mistake. And so that's where you see that dynamic happening between self-esteem and self-blame being such a downward spiral when the two of those start to get eaten up by each other.
Yeah. Now we talk about that, we are wired, as humans, to idolize our parents, and in particular, like our primary caregiver, because that idolization is what's necessary for us to be receptive and follow everything they do, because we're learning as we go. And I had seen something out there where a comment about the fact that because of that idolization and that just innate, we love our parents despite everything, then when they are abusive to us or neglectful or do things like this, we don't reflect it, but we don't turn around and recognize it as abuse to them. We still continue to love them. We just stop loving ourselves,
Exactly.
through that process.
And that at the time is a coping mechanism that's necessary. You can imagine as we evolved, if, we're coming out of the caves with our families and, that's 7, you disagree with the parents and you just stomp off into the mammoth pasture. And so when you are younger, you do defer. If they say this has been bad or I've done this badly, you tend to go, yep, that's me, that's my fault. Or if the atmosphere feels wrong in a room or in a place, you kind of think, this must have to do with me. There's that egocentricity again. And then as we grow up, we are lucky enough to find mentors and caregivers that help us see, no, this is where you end and the world begins, and you can control this piece, but you can't control everything. Recently I was counseling a very high achieving teenager about anxiety, and we had to go over the fact that part of being an adult and growing up is that you will disappoint people. You can't say yes to every opportunity and every date, and there has to be no's also. And so living with the fact that you really cannot satisfy everybody at all times, and that you do have healthy limitations, is part of that developmental piece. Now, a person who's been scapegoated can get trapped in always trying to compensate for being made to feel like things were their fault. And so they go through life always trying to overachieve, to prove to that initial family system, see, I'm fine, I'm good, I can do this. And that can put you at a disadvantage in the work environment if you start to see everybody as competition to prove to the authority figure, I need to prove I'm the best. You can be accused of not being a team player if you're constantly competing to prove you're the best. And so it really, as a scapegoat, you're usually a very strong person because you've had to be independent from the system that you grew up with, but at the same time, you have a longing to be in a system and feel that sense of community too. So you have to watch when you're older not to get kind of entrapped in trying to regain that feeling, that elusive longing that you never got satisfied when you're growing up.
Yeah, it sounds like too, like the possibilities, I'm making an assumption here, but if you have that sense of longing, love addiction might stem from something like that, or
Absolutely.
that codependencies. Yeah.
And so, love addiction is always being attracted to kind of love walking away. So if you think of heart energy coming from the front of the person, it's always kind of longing at that back walking away from you. And that person who's walking towards you with the heart, you're kind of like, oh, good, I got that, check. And then you're always looking over at that one that's kind of walking away. And that, of course, can affect your partnering and how soon you make a commitment to a life partner, if at all, and how you'll end up co-parenting. And then, of course, if you have children, then how can you stand to have them individuate? So individuation is, somebody naturally starting to pull away from everything that the parent thinks is good. And somebody who has more of a wounding that way is going to have a real hard time allowing and believing in their child as an individual. They're going to be more protective, and out of that protectiveness and fear of abandonment, they're going to want that person to be more of an extension of themselves than just out there individuating in an appropriate way.
Oh, interesting. Huh. So, because I can see with the scapegoats, where they're the truth tellers, that they're, fighting for a sense of justice, falling on the sword, like you said, kind of sticking up for what they think is right in there. But then there's that tricky balance of also realizing that when you do it, sometimes it alienates you, and it alienates you from the people that you love. And that there's I can just see and feel that back and forth of the pendulum of like, but I can't stand watching something wrong happen. But at the same time, how am I supposed to stick up for myself and not lose everybody around me that I care about and love, and swing back? So how does a scapegoat how do scapegoats kind of deal and compensate? What are kind of some of the shrouds and protections they put on themselves when that's what they're kind of living in, and that swinging back and forth?
Yeah. So first of all, they have to realize that they are vulnerable to the bidding for attention. But, just like their narcissistic parent, they do bid for attention. And it's really important to not try to establish your worth every day, every minute of your life. That you have to trust that there's a certain worthiness inherent in you, regardless of how much attention you get from someone, how valuable you are to someone. And Scapegoat is often trying to prove that they are valuable. And it's so painful because it's like you're only as valuable as your last action. So that can certainly lead to codependency.
Mm-hmm. So help me. We talked about this between the hero, scapegoat, lost child. Are there some similarities between lost and scapegoat? Do we get lost scapegoats out there?
Yes, because scapegoats sometimes need to hide because they can't sometimes stop themselves from trying to rescue and stick up for and tell the truth. And sometimes they have to distance themselves from the family because they just can't seem to be there without being the lightning rod drawing all that energy. And even sitting in a extended family, just for like a Christmas situation or Hanukkah or a wedding, these situations can feel so uncomfortable as scapegoat when they aren't getting the negative attention because they're waiting for it to happen. Or they feel like somehow they haven't shown up or that they don't exist. There's a feeling of feeling extremely anxious until there's some sort of intensity. So you can imagine how, especially at a family events where there could be alcohol available or overeating available, what people have happen. And so it's no wonder that in January, I end up with all these people calling after their holiday visits. And, there may be relapses on diets or sobriety because those drivers are very strong in situations like that when you involve the family system and you have these old wounds that you may not be aware of yet.
Yeah, yeah. And definitely I can imagine when you're in scapegoat mode, that intensity is just always there. Otherwise, you're not getting any attention if it's not some dramatic thing that's going on, whether you're getting in, do scapegoats as children tend to be the more extroverted trouble for the parent or the family? I mean, do they evolve into just the low expectation that they're ever going to behave? They're always going to be misbehaving. Is that a real statement? Or
what's ironic is that you have that, and then you also have the most quote unquote normal kid getting scapegoated too. So remember the Addams Family? I think maybe that's one of the reasons it appealed to so many people is that the one normal girl just was seen as the weirdo.
The cousin.
And then everybody else is kind of a freak.
Right.
People don't have limbs, or they're just a hand, or they're just hair. You know what I mean? There's that one girl that just looks kind of normal, and she's kind of seen as like, oh, poor thing, how's she ever going to blend in the world? And so there are times when that scapegoat is actually going to be the valedictorian at school, the one that's always doing it well. So in the school setting, they may be exceptional, but then at home, they're always seen as, the person just who can't listen, who just never can just take, an order and do it, or just do it mom's way or do it dad's way. Why do you always have to fight? Why do you always have to bring it up? And yet the siblings and sometimes the co-parent is fueling that scapegoat up with some injustice, well, don't tell mom, but it's been a really hard day with her. If you could just not act up while you're home or whatever. And that's perhaps dad unfairly dumping energy on the scapegoat. And then the scapegoat actually gets charged up to want to say something like, why do you always have to talk to dad like that, or whatever? And then there they are back in the role.
Yeah. The reason why I said at the beginning of the episode here that I felt like the scapegoat is the, mic drop, I'm out of here type of a person, it comes from, some personal experience in here of, the evolution through life, but finally, hitting 18 years old. And that was where I was at. It was like, I can't change the system. So I'm just getting the hell out of the system and I'm, moving on. I'm going to go to school and then I'm going to move away and stuff and go. So, like they said, the screw.
There's the exact landscape. Like you said, the shifting landscape. So there you were in the scapegoat. And then when you finally can leave, you're gone for a good long while. You're the one where it's like, the extended family's like, we haven't seen her in 6 years, since college or whatever. And suddenly you don't like reappear until there's a wedding so there's a lot of people that handle it that way because they could not win in that system. And they were smart enough to know it. They didn't know why. And of course, when you're young, you constantly question if it's yourself. You go from totally blaming the outside to totally blaming yourself, that pendulum. And so that's where things like cognitive behavioral therapy are helpful with that black and white thinking. It helps you with the thinking distortions, so you can kind of pull those things apart and look at, it really is rarely all your fault or all somebody else's fault. And so what's one small piece you can take when you're feeling totally blaming of somebody else? And also, when you're totally blaming yourself, what's one small thing that you didn't have control over?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's about to try to pull that back in and balance that back in, for sure.
Start to centralize the thinking and get out of extremes.
Yeah. So we kind of touched on some of them, but what are some of the problems that you'll see? Like, what draws a scapegoat into your office, finally to sit then and do they know they're scapegoats when they walk in? Or do you get to say,
a lot of times they don't.
Okay.
Yeah. So sometimes I'll have a scapegoat calling everybody in because they've decided they are not inviting so-and-so unless everybody comes in before the wedding, and they'll want to have like a meeting with 8 of the family members all at once to pull in, some injustice that they believe needs to be resolved before the wedding or things like that. So sometimes the scapegoat can be dramatic, and other times the scapegoat doesn't know they're the scapegoat and they get along with everybody in their world other than their family system. And then that is probably the one that has the hardest time recognizing they're scapegoated, because they kind of look at the rest of their family, and the rest of the family might not even be doing that well. And they're doing very well out in the world. But yet they go home to that original family system and they're treated like they are the problem again. Like somehow they have caused people pain or held the family back in some way. And, I had one man say to his family, I'm not a cocaine dealer. I just left to go off and go to college. I went out of town for college. That's all I did. But it seems like when I come back here, everybody's treating me, asking why I've deserted them and, treating me like I've wrecked the family reputation, when all I'm not doing is working at the hardware business this 4 years. So sometimes it kind of helps to like share the experience outside with somebody not in the family system, where you can say, it feels like I murdered someone and buried them at home. And every time I come home, people are pointing at the dead body. And all I did was marry, or,
right.
Or they individuate. And that was somehow resented by the family system.
Yeah. Yeah. I know moving out to Seattle from the Midwest, I kept hearing like, well, when are you coming back? She'll be back soon. And then it was like, a few years went by. I don't think she's coming back. But, I know for myself, I feel like I identify here with scapegoat. I've identified with the hero, not the golden, but the hero child piece of it. And I know so in my head, I'm sitting here trying to distinguish really between those two, because I don't feel that I ever was blamed for everything. But I do know that I was a truth teller, like I would, I'd let the family flow with something. And then when it got to a place where I was just, okay, no guys, no, I can't do this anymore, which, as you know, and we've talked about this, that's what sets you up to be the enemy combatant in about every other relationship that you get, where you start to point out, like, that's not the way this needs to go. You need to stop teasing me, stop hitting him, whatever it is. But at the end of the day, it wasn't like I ever was treated like I was the pariah for being that person. It was just like it shocked and awed everybody for a moment. And then there was that sense of still respect because of the hero pieces of me, so like you talk about the valedictorian as being the weirdo that, and everybody makes fun of or doesn't get or whatever. I definitely know that wasn't the feeling that I'd ever had in there, but I do identify with the when Ami comes home, and I have an uncle who's the same way, and he and I would both be like the ones in the room, and at some point,
Yeah.
maybe both of us challenging like the way it should be, or I wouldn't follow
Right.
along with the group thing because it's like I didn't agree with it and stuff. So I'm trying to sort that out for
Yeah.
myself
So
here on.
that was a burden and an honor, right?
Yeah, yeah,
The burden is, okay, wait till she comes home. Other people in the family know, all right, we can load you up and then, we'll get some justice going on in this. Or, wait till we hear what she has to say.
yeah,
Or I don't need to confront anybody because I know she will.
yeah, yeah,
you know
yeah,
and so when you're trying to reconcile the roles, which I think is really helpful for people to hear, because I know people try to search through and try to figure out what role were they most usually dominant in. Of
hmm,
course they do shift, and you identify very strongly with the scapegoat role. What other pieces do you wonder, oh, where did that fit in with scapegoat? Is that what you're kind of exploring there?
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's the pieces of it, of what parts of it were the scapegoating parts. And I guess because I have a really strong sense of justice. I mean, it's super strong right now
Mm-hmm.
for me. And that's usually when we talked about the business piece of it, was being involved in some sort of a professional, and I see it in my son. I was just talking about this today too, that hypocrisy is a trigger. So if somebody in an authority
Mm-hmm.
position begins to behave manipulatively, or is,
Mm-hmm.
hypocritical, or just, it has some part of it that is just injustice, then when they want to assert their authority on me, I won't have it. If you have some sort of moral leaning that isn't good, there's you're a liar, you do things for it. I don't care if you're my boss. I don't care if you're, a partner or something like that. I will stand up against it to the point of it just exploding, in everybody's face and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I'm wondering, like, is that the scapegoat piece of it? This sense
Yeah,
of,
it is,
yeah,
because it's the part that you're willing to go to. If it takes an explosion, I'll do the explosion.
yeah, totally,
Whereas a
yeah,
golden child would have had like the way to manipulate everybody into
yeah,
their justice in a good, in the smooth way that doesn't cost them. The scapegoat, the way you can tell the difference between hero and scapegoat is right there at the price you pay. So if you're hero child, it's like, oh, listen to so and so, she really helps us think better, or makes us better people. But scapegoat is like, oh, it's not what you say but how you say it.
yeah,
Like, yeah, you're right, but you didn't need to do it that way. You didn't need to blow up that way. You didn't have to bring that intensity, that tone, these words, even though the general point was correct. So it's the intensity that you could look at and go, yep, that's scapegoat.
Interesting. That's an enlightening. I love these with you because it's like every time for me personally, and hopefully I get, other people do see this recognition in there, but yeah, I mean, I was that person that if, had a family member that would make a racist comment, we'd be in a crowded room full of people. And I guarantee, I mean, I did this, I would be the one person that stood up, looked at him and said, again, my strong sense of justice has always been there to take it, and,
Yes.
do it at any cost. And it hurt me at times
Yes. And
because,
it does.
yeah,
And I think so much of the archetype of Joan of Arc with scapegoat, because here she was burnt at the stake and then later she was sainted for the same behavior.
right, right.
So, there's, you can see the heroic part of it and also the scapegoated part of it right there. So if you feel a little confused sometime, you're in a good company.
Yeah. Jeez, I don't want to be burned at the stake though. So,
Yeah,
um,
indeed.
yeah. So, what are some of the other problems you might have a scapegoat? Because I know you coach too, and I sit there and I think, like, for me, a benefit would have been to have known that sense of justice was triggered by injustices around me, even if they were in professional
Yes.
settings and stuff like that. So, how would you coach a scapegoat? I'm not asking for myself because I'm trying to get a free session here with you, but when
Well,
somebody is held that way. Well, to be
you know,
honest, I like the fact that I stand for justice. That's not a bad thing to
yes.
me, right?
It is not a bad thing. And so with scapegoat, what's very important to me when I coach them is that they don't lose their sense of identity. I don't want to change them out of anything that they are. I want to give them more choices when
Hmm.
they to decide to champion something. And often scapegoats will call me in order to deal with upcoming perceived potentials for confrontation with family, especially when the family groups together for a birth or, whatever event, or you're coming to home turf, or they're coming to your home turf. That's where the scapegoat often needs help in revealing their truth in a way that does not set them up to feel apologetic later about how they did it. That robs them of their message. And I hate seeing that happen to such a valiant personality type.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just helping them take that beautiful flame of truth and not accidentally singeing their own hair with it.
Burning the eyebrows off. Yeah.
Yes, because usually everything they're saying and all their instincts are right on the money. It's actually a matter of delivery often.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we can help with the delivery so that you can retain more power, and speak into other people's ability to listen,
Mm-hmm.
then the scapegoat's self-esteem tends to raise and sense of efficacy.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's exciting to see in people.
Yeah. And I can see too, in fact, my chest was tightening up as we're talking about this because of the comment, not in a bad way, but just like the rise of like, oh my gosh, like I'm feeling this, like I get this piece of it. How do you help them through the things that might trigger? Because intensity is a thing,
Yes.
and that intensity flares up sometimes in really inappropriate situations, where
Right.
a person offers, and this actually happens. So I sit with this quite a bit still, even though I do therapy. This is just how hard it is. But, somebody made a comment to me, not being critical, not being anything. And most of the time I actually do receive feedback. And I sometimes, and in fact, I just talked to somebody today. I said, I'm going to apologize in advance if I come off defensive, just like instantly. But I do love feedback. I do want to grow. I do want to be better here. But I do know sometimes, I don't know why, that little flare will come up, and I might feel like defensive about it. And that feels like the scapegoat piece of it. And it matters who I'm talking to on whether or not it flares up or not.
Oh,
But
absolutely.
yeah. And I know that for me, again, I share this, and people do know that I'm not perfect. That's why I do a show called One Broken Mom. But sometimes it was
if there
not
was one perfect mom.
right. I don't think anybody'd listen.
Yeah, nobody would.
Right. Like, I can't identify with that. But I do know that from that professional standpoint, that it wasn't fair. That sense of justice was misplaced. I wasn't really fighting anything. It was a fight that was inside my own head, or it was a fight that was triggered by, not in my own head, but again, the confrontation caused the intensity to rise. Then I perceived danger that I don't think was entirely there. And, and it turned into a problem. Like I have ran into people where there has been a moral question, but I do have one gentleman in particular. And I was able to I totally respected the guy, but we just got to that place where we both were kind of getting into each other. And I know it was unfair. It was unfair for me to have a sense of justice against it when I should have been able to pull myself back in and talk with them and restrain it. But that intense trigger is really, really strong. Like, how do you bring somebody off of the cliff, or, what are strategies for somebody that wants to keep fighting the world and they don't really have to?
Yep. So excellent question. And it's one simple way that you can start getting mastery over this is to grade your response 1, 2, 3. It's 3 different levels. 3 is you're already doing and saying things that you are not in control of or would regret later. 2 is you feel like that's possible. And 1 is you're totally calm and you can field things from 20 miles away. You can be very strategic. You want to be in a 1, especially when you're hearing feedback, and yet rarely do people give you the room to get ready for feedback. And so it's very important once you kind of start to assess, okay, this is an incoming, and I need to, hear this, and I want to receive the grain of truth that might be in this so that I can be a better person. or a more effective worker, whatever it is. And so that's where you want to stay, in that one place. If you have somebody storming into your office, your bedroom, whatever, and that immediately makes you feel cornered, you're maybe already at a 2, because instinctively as an animal, we do not want to have our exits cut off. Then say, oh, I hear you have something you want to say to me, or this is an interesting discussion. Let's go out into the living room. So you get down to a 1. So first get your physiology in place and make sure you're not in fight, flight, or freeze, because we're in that emotional posture in a narcissistic family system, or any kind of tumultuous system. And so we have to make sure our arousal system is down, and that deep breathing, we can do 4 square breathing, where you breathe in 4, hold 4, breathe out 4. Some people want to do that as a 5-5-7. Whatever you need to do to get your breathing right, that is the most effective thing you can do, and it's portable. If you're in the room, your breath is in the room.
Thank God.
So, there's other things you can use, like calming music, the right temperature, essential oils, but you may not have that access. But thankfully, you always have access to breath. So do your breath work before you reply. Allow yourself to buy yourself time and say, I want to repeat this back to you so I make sure I'm hearing you correctly, and say, okay, I hear that you're saying that when I did X, you think it would have been better if I had done Y first. Is that correct? Yes. Okay. Am I missing anything? And you let them unpack and unpack and unpack. And just that starts calming you down. Imagine they've brought in a suitcase of feedback, and you're making sure they've unpacked their carry-on, and you're wading through it instead of trying to organize it while they're talking, or trying to close it and put it in the overhead bin while they're talking. It's going to set you up to have problems. So that 1 to 3 system works really well. Like, let's say you got an email and you're already at a 2, somebody wants to talk to you about something, somebody just called you. Let the call go until you're back at a 1, then call back. But don't take the call when you're already at a 2, because you can bump up really fast to that 3. So try to be operating out of a 1 and always trying to get back down to a 1.
That's great. And that's great advice. And I want to touch on that for some, for anybody that's listening to this, to, why this might actually happen. Because like we said, the scapegoat is living in a space of really defending their position, defending someone else's position. And, if that's a constant for you, or having to assert your position, assertion is another piece of that too. I feel like if you're being disregarded, or, you're trying to be boxed or bubbled in, this scapegoat personality sounds like, I'm raising my hand here, where you have to finally you're fed up to the point that you have to rise up and go, no, you need to see me. You need to understand this is who I am, or whatever it is. And that on a regular basis means you go off into the world with that, latency, that intensity in there. Absolutely. And so I want other people that are thinking, again, this isn't the me show here, but if that feels familiar to you, that you have to raise the level of the room in order to feel like you finally are breaking through too many times, not all the time. And I don't, like I said, people that know me are going to go, you've done that before? And I'm like, oh yeah, I've done this before. But I know that I still get, there are those triggers in there with certain types of people, which probably goes back to if they are more narcissistic, or, have that and more of their needs kind of, you feel that, right? And I know you have some experience with this family dynamic as well, that our radars sense that out of other people, that they have the capabilities at time to do that. So that's what I'm talking about, is sometimes when we get in those situations, that little role pops its ugly little head up and can cause problems for us without it.
And sometimes you can feel it prickly. Like, I really know it's over if I feel hot little pins in my face. I know I'm at a 3. And and so that's what I mean by getting in touch with your physiology. For some people, it's they feel hot, or they notice they're clenching their hands or their jaw, or they've stopped breathing, or they're shallow breathing. So just get aware of where you're at.
Yeah.
And what you've touched upon just in that last comment too was scapegoats are warriors. They've come out of a war often. And so there's a traumatic response to a lot of things that might not be as bad as the narcissistic family system, but it reminds you of it. And already that physiological response is in fight, flight, freeze. And usually it's fight with a scapegoat.
Yeah. And that you just hit it, because I have made a lot of reflections for me. Like I joked, I did an interview the other day for a show called Real Men Feel. And I said coming into 2019, which is when we're recording this, that my operative word for the year is anger and rage. Like that's the part of, and I don't mean that in like a really grumpy, negative sort of way, but it's the unconnected part that I really do want to get. And you saying that is how that has felt. Like that's the last piece for me that I feel like I've taken care of 6-year-old in me, and I've taken care of middle school in me, but it's the 18-year-old I'm out of here, soldier woman that is still in there, that she's been dodging it, around there, and getting to that piece of it. And I'm glad you said, and like I said, I'm saying it again, I'm glad you said anger, because that is it's a hard emotion, I think, for people to tackle and acknowledge, because I believe it's the emotion that a lot of us have told has been, it's, you can't be mad. Don't be mad. Being mad is a bad thing. And we can't honor anger, around us and stuff, because it's super uncomfortable.
Right. And anger is a great fuel. It simply needs to be used for the right things in your life. So sometimes I have people so frustrated when they feel their anger in coaching. And I say, that's actually a really important tank you just tapped into right there. Furthermore, anxiety is often anger being ignored. Mm-hmm. So often people will feel so anxious and panicky and have a loss of concentration because they're actually suppressing this anger. And anger to them means I will be further ostracized, because every time I was angry in my family, I was seen as monstrous. Mm-hmm. And often I might have acted monstrously because I was pushed to a level of gaslighting that made me so frustrated. It's crazy making, is what these clients will tell me. And so always be aware that that was just a learned response to a very extreme situation, and that anger in and of itself is extremely important. It is the thing that allows us to assert our boundaries in a nice, polite way, because we don't want to sit with it. Once you get in touch with your anger, you're like, either you're going to end up dealing with my discomfort or I am. So I'm just going to say, please stop stepping on my toe. Instead of just going, I don't want to deal with it, to put up with it, maybe she'll move, maybe she'll get off my toe. It is so much better to put it into assertiveness calmly instead of waiting for a boiling point, because so many scapegoats will condemn themselves for feeling any anger because they were seen as the angry child when they were younger.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And and for people that were not that way, because I wasn't seen as an angry child, I just became very obedient to hold it back, because the blowback was...
You erred to overcompliance?
Yeah, I went over into overcompliance, definitely, and just kind of like bottled it all up until I got to be a teenager, and I was just like, F this, I'm done. Like I just, that's where it came out. But even then, yeah, as a kid, nobody would say I was an angry child. I was an overly compliant, but just angry inside because I couldn't do what I really wanted to do. And then as I got older, I found myself having the ability to finally, again, start to move into the truth teller phase.
So and just see it as a water flow. Mm-hmm. And it's simply a need to channel it. And for some reason, the messages in your family were, damn it up, don't have it be coming down over here. But there was no skill taught to you about how to channel that in the direction where it would be useful, or to redirect, or to temper it. It was just, you were just told, shut it off. And that doesn't work. With water will always win. Mm-hmm. The force of water will always win. And so it's good to look at your anger just as a water flow, and you have to learn how to ride it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I wanted to give you a chance, because first of all, I'm glad the timing worked out with Scapegoat being the last one, because I think that this was cool. Like, for me personally, I'm not trying to be selfish here, but I did grow up in a narcissistic family, so that But anyways, but in all sincerity, I think this is a good way of kind of going through those roles. But you've been working on a book, and I really want to give you a chance to talk about that, because you and I will be talking about it with other topics, but right now we've had to schedule around some of the editing. So tell everybody about the book that you're actually writing.
Yeah. So, the book that I'm working on is called The Narcissistic Mother.
That's good.
And ironically, and it gives a chapter to each role. And it also gives a chapter to caring for aging parents throughout the lifespan when you deal with narcissistic family systems. And then how does this show up in real life in the present as an adult? And what can you do about it? So the seeds were planted from the narcissistic family system. And then now as an adult, there's going to be these little patches of immature behavior that you're like, whoa, where did that come from? Where did that intensity come from? And so looking at how to optimize your life, knowing where you came from and what the typical pitfalls are, how can we use those things for strength and fuel and wisdom and accomplishing your goals? So that's where we're at. And that, I would think that, we're in the final 2 chapters. I say we because I always make my partner read the chapters as they're done. So, June 1st is when it'll be ready. So that's not that far away.
No, that's not. That's awesome. So Scapegoat, do you feel like we got everything that we need to, because I don't want to dismiss our episode today without making sure that we touched on this. Like I said, this kind of is like the final nail in this whole family piece of this. Is there...
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I will say often scapegoats are the first ones to get help. Often they are the ones sent to therapy in high school. Sometimes even treatment centers, things like that, because their behavior is seen as this extreme. Where is this coming from? Everybody else is so well behaved. And they're really expressing the frustration for the entire family.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're carrying all of that. There was a great old movie with, I forgot the name of the person, but it's Mi Familia. And it was such a good movie about family roles. And there was a scapegoat in that movie. And what I can say about the scapegoat is they're the strongest people I know. And I love them very much. I think that it is a tragic thing to be seen as a problem when you simply have a lot of passion and need to know how to channel it.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. I think we're going to end it right there with that, Michelle, because that's a beautiful sentiment for anybody out there. So, Michelle, I appreciate you so much. I know I've told you that so many times, and now I can actually say it to your face because I'm looking at you right now. But it's been a blessing to have gotten to know you over the last several months doing this. I know I'm grateful for this. I know the people that listen to the show have been really grateful to hear you help us through these things and stuff. And so thank you again so much for taking the time to be able to do this with me and to do this other episode. So
you're so welcome, and you're such a brave person doing this. I'm really excited always to hear about how your audience is reacting to things. So congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you so much.